The coffee was still steaming when I found it. I hadn't even sat down yet, still standing at the counter in yesterday's clothes, laptop open from the night before, and there it was. A financial news piece, published at 6:04 in the morning. And the deal it was describing in clean, confident detail was mine. A deal I had closed privately 3 weeks earlier. A deal that had no press release, no announcement, no public filing. A deal where exactly 4 people in the world knew the specific structure, the numbers, the timeline. I read it twice. The second time, slower than the first. The details weren't approximate. They weren't the kind of things someone pieces together from public records or a lucky guess. Whoever talked to that journalist knew the room. They knew what was said and what wasn't. They knew things that were never written down anywhere except in my own files and in conversations I had trusted completely. I was still standing there when my phone lit up on the counter at 7-Eleven. The name on the screen was Cal. I watched it ring. 4 times. 5. I didn't move. The call dropped, and 30 seconds later the voicemail notification came through, and I picked up the phone and hit play and held it out in front of me like I needed the distance. His voice was easy, almost cheerful. "Hey, it's me. Did you see that piece this morning? Crazy stuff. Call me back when you get a chance." The message ended, and the kitchen was quiet, and I set the phone down next to the untouched coffee and looked back at the screen. The article was still open. 6:04 a.m. His call came in at 7-Eleven. He had read it before he called me to ask if I'd seen it. 6 weeks before the article ran, I had Cal over on a Thursday. He showed up the way he always did, a little louder than the room, a 6-pack under his arm, asking about the kitchen renovation before he even had his jacket off. We've been friends since our first year of college. 20-something years of the same easy rhythm, the same shorthand. I trusted him the way you trust a wall that's always been there. You stop checking whether it's still solid. We were 2 beers in when I started talking about the deal. I wasn't being careless. Cal had been around my work long enough to understand the landscape, and he'd kept things close before, or I believed he had. So when he asked how things were moving, I told him. The company, the structure, the price range, the timeline, all of it. He sat at my kitchen island with his beer, and he listened the way Cal always listened when he was paying real attention, leaning forward slightly, asking questions that showed he'd actually processed what I'd said. "Is the seller motivated, or are they just fishing?" he asked at one point. "Motivated," I said. "They needed to be out by quarter end." He nodded. "And the structure? Are you carrying any exposure past close?" "Minimal," I said. "We built the protections in early." He asked maybe 4 or 5 questions like that. Good questions. The kind that made me feel like I was talking to someone who understood what the deal actually meant. I filled in every answer. I didn't hesitate once. At the door, when he was pulling on his jacket and picking up the 2 beers we hadn't gotten to, he stopped with one hand on the frame. His tone shifted just slightly, still easy but with something underneath it. "Hey," he said, "things have been a little tight on my end. That project I told you about, the one up north, it fell through. And my landlord is being a pain about the renewal." He half smiled. "If anything advisory comes out of this deal, anything where you need a hand and could keep me in mind, I'd appreciate it." I said, "Of course." Same as I always did. Same as I'd said probably a dozen times over the years in a dozen different versions of that same conversation. He nodded. "I know you're good for it." He left, and I locked up and didn't think about it again. 3 weeks later, the deal closed. Clean. Everything I'd built toward for the better part of a year came through the way I'd planned it, and I sent Cal a short message that night. Just, "It went through. Lunch soon." His reply came back in under a minute. "A thumbs up and proud of you, brother." I read it and smiled and set my phone face down on the desk and moved on to the next thing. I didn't think about the doorway. I didn't think about the questions. I didn't think about what he'd asked to be kept in mind for, or how tight things had gotten for him, or what that pressure might look like from the inside of it. I just moved on. That's the part one keep coming back to. Not what he did. The part where I just moved on. How many people had that information, and how many of them needed something? I went back to the article and read it the way I should have read it the first time. Not for the story, for the details. The price corridor was in there. Not the exact number, but a range tight enough that anyone in the deal knew exactly what it meant. The structure was described in a way that matched the specific language we'd used internally, not the kind of approximation a journalist builds from inference. And then there was the nickname. We'd called it the Meridian Project in early conversations. Not officially, never in any filing, just something that stuck in the first few weeks when we were still feeling out whether this was even going to happen. It was in the article. Third paragraph from the bottom. Meridian. I got a notepad from a drawer and wrote down 4 names. The other party's attorney. My CFO, Marcus. Devika. And then underneath those 3, with some space above it, one more name. I looked at the list for a moment, and then I picked up the phone and called Devika. Devika had been my attorney for 6 years. The kind of precise that borders on cold until you realize it's just that she doesn't waste words on things that won't help you. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her there was a piece in the financial press this morning, and I was going to read it to her. She didn't say anything while I read. When I finished, she asked one question. Outside the deal team, who did you discuss specifics with in the weeks before close? I said one name. The pause on her end was short, but I felt the full weight of it. Don't call him back yet, she said. Forward me the article. I'll call you within the hour. Dev. Forward me the article, she said again. And don't call him. She hung up, and I set the phone down and looked at the notepad. 3 names tied to contracts, NDAs, professional exposure. People who had everything to lose and nothing obvious to gain. And one name written below the others with nothing around it. No contract, no agreement. Just a Thursday evening and 2 beers and a conversation I'd had because I trusted the wall without checking whether it was still standing. When a leak comes from the one conversation that was never documented, there's nothing on paper to point to, nothing signed, nothing that puts him in that room except my word and his, and one of us was never going to tell the truth about what happened there. Devika called back in 40 minutes. She'd already spoken to someone at the publication, off the record, through a contact she didn't name and I didn't ask about. What she told me was this. The piece had been sourced from a single tip. One person. The tip came in 3 weeks earlier, after the deal had closed, but before we'd made any public announcement. And the tipster had used a personal email address. Not anonymized, not routed. A personal account with a name attached to it. She had the name. She had the timestamp. She wasn't sharing either yet. You have 2 options, she said. You let this go, and we monitor for damage. Or you call him back on a recorded line and have a normal conversation. Don't accuse him. Don't tell him what you know. Just talk to him the way you normally would and listen to what he volunteers. I said I wanted to call. I know, she said. Record it from your end. Keep it under 10 minutes. Don't let him take you somewhere emotional. I set up the recording, found his name in my contacts, and sat there for a minute before I hit dial. Cal picked up on the second ring. Hey, there he is, he said. Did you see it? Yeah, I said. Just read it this morning. Bit of a strange way to start the day. I bet. How are you feeling about it? Annoyed more than anything, I said. It was a clean close. Didn't need the noise. Totally, he said. You know what I think? I think it came from someone on the other side. Their team was bigger. More people means more mouths. Someone probably wanted the credit without waiting for the announcement. I said probably. Or their attorney, he said. Those guys talk. Not to be cynical, but some of them can't help themselves. They close a deal, and they need someone to know about it. I said maybe. He kept going. He had a theory for every name except one. He talked about the structure of deals like ours, and how information moves, and how journalists develop sources over years, and how really it could have come from anywhere. He was thorough about it, almost impressive. And then somewhere in the middle of it, he said something about the valuation sitting where it did given the seller's timeline pressure, and how in retrospect that corridor was probably always going to land in that range given where the market was sitting. I didn't say anything, just made a sound that meant I was still listening. The corridor he described wasn't in the article. The article had the range, but not the reasoning behind it. The seller's timeline pressure, that specific framing, that specific phrase, that was from my kitchen. That was from a Thursday evening 6 weeks ago when he was leaning over my island asking good questions, and I was filling in every answer. He didn't realize he'd said it. He just kept talking. 9 minutes and 14 seconds. I said very little. He said a lot. When we hung up, he told me to let him know if there was anything he could do, and I said I would. I set the phone down on the desk and looked at the recording icon on the screen. I don't know how you finish a call like that. I just did. I sent Devika the recording at 12:22, and she called me back just before 2. I listened to it twice, she said. The detail he mentioned, the seller's timeline pressure framing, and the corridor reasoning. That language is not in the article. I know, I said. It's not in any document outside the deal room, she said. Not in the term sheet. Not in the correspondence. Not in the closing summary. The only place that specific framing exists is in verbal conversation. I already knew what she was going to say next. Your kitchen, she said. That's the only place that came from. She told me to sit tight and let her keep working. I said fine and put the phone down and stood at the window for a while watching nothing in particular. At 3:40 my cell rang, and the name on the screen was Richard O'Say, the CEO of the company we'd acquired. Richard was not a man who called without a reason, and he was not a man who let you hear the reason before he was ready to give it. Marcus, he said, I'll keep this short. I appreciate that, I said. My board has questions. They saw the piece this morning, and they have questions about how a private transaction ended up in the financial press 3 weeks before our announcement window. He stopped. The leak created a problem for us on a parallel negotiation. The other party used it as leverage. It cost us. Another stop. Deliberate. I'm going to assume you're looking into it on your side. I already am, I said. Good. He didn't say anything else for a moment. I worked with you for a long time, Marcus. I want this handled cleanly. It will be, I said. I'm glad to hear it, he said, and then he was gone. I sat with that call for a long time after it ended. Richard had given me something in the way he framed it. One chance extended professionally through gritted teeth. There was a board behind him asking questions I couldn't answer yet. There was a negotiation somewhere that had already taken damage I hadn't caused but would be held accountable for anyway. There were rooms I would never be in where my name was being said in a tone I couldn't control. All of it tracing back to a Thursday evening and a man who asked good questions and remembered every answer. At 7:18, that evening my phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Cal. You good? You sounded weird earlier. Let's grab dinner this week, my treat. I stared at it for a long time. The easy rhythm of it. The casual offer. My treat. Like nothing had shifted, like the morning hadn't happened, like 9 minutes on a recorded line hadn't already told me everything I needed to know. I put the phone face down and didn't reply. Somewhere out there, a negotiation had already absorbed the cost of what he'd done, and he was offering to buy me dinner. Devika called at 8 the next morning. Her contact at the publication had agreed to do something he had no professional obligation to do. The tipster had left a voicemail 3 weeks earlier. Not a written tip, a voicemail, and the journalist had kept it. He was willing to forward it quietly on one condition. If anything came of it, the narrator would not name the publication and would not name the journalist. Ever. She said she'd have it by end of day. I told her to confirm the terms and said I'd hold to them. She said she knew I would and hung up. I sat at my desk and tried to work. I got through maybe an hour of it before I heard my assistant's voice in the hallway, and then a knock, and then the door opened, and Cal walked in. He hadn't called ahead. He never used a need to. There'd been a decade and a half where that was just how it worked between us, and I never once minded. I'm minded now. I kept my face where it was and gestured to the chair across from my desk, and he sat down, and he looked tired in a way that wasn't just the morning. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the desk between us. I need to tell you something, he said. My chest tightened. I've been struggling, he said, more than I've been letting on. And I did something stupid a few months back, and I've been carrying it around, and I don't want you to hear about it from somewhere else first. I didn't say anything. I watched his face. I took out a personal loan, he said. Private lender. The terms were bad, and I knew they were bad, and I did it anyway, because I was trying to bridge a gap that didn't close the way I thought it would. And now I'm behind on it, and it's getting worse, and I'm embarrassed. He looked up. I'm embarrassed, and I didn't want you to find out sideways. The room was quiet. He kept going. He told me the amount. He told me who the lender was. He told me how far behind he was and what the penalty structure looked like and how he'd been avoiding the calls. He was specific. He was thorough. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this and hated that he'd had to. And I sat there across from my oldest friend, and I could not tell what I was looking at. Because either Cal had come to me because he was drowning and I was the person he trusted most in the world, and this was exactly what it looked like, a man who needed help and was too proud to ask for it cleanly and was doing his best anyway. Or he had come to me because he already knew the voicemail existed, because he knew what was coming, because if he could make the next conversation about his loan and his embarrassment and his trust in me, then the conversation after that became harder to have. 20 years of knowing someone, and I was sitting across from him trying to read his face like a stranger. I used to know the difference between Cal trusting me and Cal working me. That morning, I genuinely did not. I hear you, I said. Let me think about what I can do. He nodded. He looked relieved, or he looked like a man performing relief. I couldn't separate the two anymore, and that was its own kind of answer. He left 20 minutes later, and I sat at my desk and waited for end of day and tried to remember the last time I've been certain about anything that had to do with him. The voicemail came through at 6:47 in the evening. Devika was already on speaker when it arrived. I opened the file and hit play, and we both listened, and neither of us said anything while it ran. It was Cal's voice. No question, no ambiguity. The easy rhythm of it, the same cadence I'd heard 1,000 times, except this time he was leaving a tip with a journalist and naming the deal by its structure, and at one point using the word meridian like it meant nothing, like it was public knowledge, like he hadn't learned it sitting at my kitchen island with a beer in his hand. The timestamp on the file was 3 weeks before the article ran, 2 days after the deal closed. When finished, I hit stop and the office went quiet. Devika spoke first. You have 3 directions, she said. Civil action, we document everything, the recording, the voicemail, the detail he volunteered on the recorded call, and we build a case. It's slow and it's expensive, and it becomes a thing. She paused. Second option, I make some calls to people in the industry who need to know who they're dealing with. Quiet, no court, but permanent. Another pause, where you sit across from him and you let him know that you know. In person, on the record. Nothing ambiguous. I didn't need long. I want to talk to him, I said. She nodded once. Then here's what you do. You don't accuse. You don't explain what you have. You let him talk first. You give him a space to say whatever he's going to say, and you listen to all of it. She leaned forward slightly, and then you play him the voicemail. That's it, she said. You don't need to say anything after that. The voicemail says everything. Whatever he does next, that's the information. She told me what not to say. No threats, no demands, nothing that could be characterized as coercion or leverage. I was there to let him know what I knew. That was the entire purpose of the conversation. Nothing more. I'm over it where silence ends. Subscribe if any of this sounds familiar. I picked up my phone and typed, "Come by my place tomorrow night. We should talk properly." His reply came back in under a minute. "Of course, brother. Anything you need." I read it twice. The word brother sitting there the way it always did, easy and automatic. The same word he'd used in a dozen texts and twice on that recorded call, and once in a voicemail to a journalist where he burned 15 years of friendship for a tip fee and a story that ran at 6:04 in the morning. I put the phone down and went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood there drinking it slowly. Devika was right. I didn't need to say anything after the voicemail. I didn't need to argue or explain or build toward anything. I just needed to be in a room when he heard his own voice say the thing he never admitted to. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, because I kept thinking about the man who was going to walk through my door tomorrow and smile and call me brother and have no idea that I was already on the other side of something he didn't know had ended. Cal showed up at 8 with a bottle of red and a smile I'd seen 1,000 times. I opened the door and let him in and didn't take the wine. I sat on the counter still wrapped and asked him to sit down. He looked around the apartment the way he always did when he arrived, easy and familiar, and pulled out the stool at the kitchen island. The same stool, the same spot, and sat down like it was any other Thursday. I put the printed article on the counter between us. He looked at it, and he looked up at me. "Still can't believe someone did that," he said. "You doing okay with it? Tell me what you think happened," I said. He didn't hesitate. Cal never hesitated when he had somewhere to go with a conversation. He started with the other side's team, 2 names specifically, guys he'd met once at an event and always found a little off, the kind who talked too much at the wrong times. He built that out for a few minutes, gave it texture, made it feel considered. Then he moved to the journalist. How these guys cultivate sources for years, how a tip like this could have come from anywhere in the chain, how it didn't even have to be intentional. Someone says something at dinner and it moves. And then he looked across the counter at me and said, "Honestly, I'd look at Marcus. Your CFO. I know you trust him, but he's been around a long time, and sometimes guys like that start thinking the information is partly theirs." He said it with a straight face. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He talked for almost 10 minutes. I nodded when he paused. I asked 1 or 2 questions that gave him room to keep going, and he filled every inch of the room I gave him. Then I picked up my phone and opened the file and pressed play and set on the counter between us. His voice came out of the speaker. Easy, unhurried, naming the deal, describing the structure, and then the word meridian sitting in the middle of my kitchen like something that had always been there, and I'd just now finally seen it. Cal went still, not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a man who has just heard the door close and understood that it locked from the outside. The voicemail ran to the end. I picked up the phone and set it face down. He opened his mouth. "Marcus, let me explain." "You already did," I said. 3 weeks ago." He closed his mouth. "Open it again." I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was in a bad place, and someone reached out, and I thought it would just be background. I didn't think they'd—" "Cal." He stopped. "I saw the loan," I said. "I heard the doorway ask. I read the text you sent after the deal closed. I kept my voice level, and then I listened to you sit in that chair for 10 minutes and tell me it was probably Marcus." He looked at the counter. "Here's what happens next," I said. "I'm not filing anything. I'm not going public. But you don't have access to me anymore. Not to my work, not to my thinking, not to these rooms. And the industry is small enough that I won't need to make any calls. That part will move on its own." The kitchen was quiet. "Marcus, the leak I could have worked with," I said. "People do stupid things when they're desperate. I know that." I looked at him across the counter. "But you called me the next morning and asked if I'd seen it. You called me to watch." He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. He stood up eventually. He left the wine on the counter. He didn't look at me again on the way to the door, and I didn't walk him out. The door closed, and the kitchen was quiet, and the bottle was still sitting there wrapped in tissue paper like it had arrived for a different night entirely. Cal called 4 times in the first 48 hours. I watched the name come up on my screen each time and let it go to voicemail. On the second day, a long message came through. I read it once. It started as an apology, moved into explanation, and by the end had arrived at a request to talk like men, not through lawyers. The progression took about 4 paragraphs and was almost impressive in how quickly it covered the distance from sorry to aggrieved. I forwarded it to Devika without comment. She sent him a letter 2 days later. Short, professional. It instructed all future contact to go through her office. I don't know if he called her. If he did, she didn't mention it. A week after the kitchen conversation, my phone rang, and it was Danny, one of the core group from college, someone I'd known almost as long as I'd known Cal. He got to the point quickly because Danny always did. "Cal's been calling around," he said. "He's telling people you cut him off in a dark moment, that you went cold on him when he came to you for help. He came to me the same morning I found out he leaked a private deal to a journalist." I said, "Okay, Danny said. 3 weeks after it happened, I said. 2 days after the deal closed. There was a pause. I figured it was something like that. I sent Danny a 3-sentence summary that evening. What Cal had done, what I had found, what I had said to him about it. No embellishment. Just the shape of it, clean and short. Within a week, 2 other people from the group reached out to me separately. Not to defend Cal, just to let me know they'd heard something and wanted to understand what actually happened. I told them the same thing I told Danny. Same 3 sentences. One of them, a guy named Pete who'd known Cal since before any of us, said something I didn't expect. This isn't the first time, Pete said. Not like this. Not this big. But the pattern, yeah. Some of us have seen pieces of it. He stopped for a second. We just never thought to say anything because it was Cal. I didn't respond to that right away, because that sentence held something I hadn't been prepared for. Not the betrayal. I've been living inside that for a week already. But the idea that people around me had seen something I hadn't. That the pattern had been visible from angles I'd never thought to look from. That I'd been the last one to notice something about a man I thought I knew better than anyone. I called Richard Osei the next morning. He picked up and I told him plainly what I'd found. The voicemail, the timing, the recorded call, the specific detail Cal had volunteered that wasn't in the article. I told him what I'd done about it and what I hadn't done. Richard listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 2 questions, both precise, both answered in under a minute. Appreciate the call, he said. And that was it. The parallel negotiation that had stalled reopened the following week. Nobody mentioned the article again. I sat at my desk the evening after Richard's call and thought about Pete's words. Not the first time, just the biggest. How many rooms had Cal walked into behind me? How many conversations had he been adjacent to? How many times had I filled in the details because he asked good questions and I trusted the wall without checking whether it was still standing? I didn't have an answer. That was its own kind of answer. 6 months later, I closed another deal. Larger than the first. Cleaner in every way that mattered. The circle of people who knew the details before close was smaller than it had ever been. Not because I'd built a system around it or made a rule, just because I'd stopped filling in answers to questions I hadn't been asked. It turned out that was all it ever required. The kitchen island conversation, the casual update over a beer, the habit of thinking out loud with someone because they'd always been there, that wasn't part of my life anymore. I thought I'd miss it more than I did. I heard about Cal through someone I barely knew, a passing mention, the kind that lands without drama. The loan had gotten worse. He tried to move a few more pieces of secondhand information to people who might find them useful. The people who used to take his calls had stopped taking his calls. That was all I heard, and it was enough. I didn't feel what I thought I'd feel. There was no satisfaction in it. No sense of the account being settled. There was just a kind of quiet where something heavy used to be, a weight I'd apparently been carrying long enough that I'd stopped noticing it was there until the morning it was gone. On a Sunday afternoon, about 6 months after the kitchen conversation, I was at my island again. A friend named Owen was sitting across from me. Not new, not someone who'd arrived after everything happened. Someone who'd been around quietly for years, who'd never once asked what I was working on, who'd never angled for a door I hadn't opened myself. We'd fallen into the habit of Sunday coffee every few weeks, and I hadn't thought much about why until that afternoon. We were talking about nothing. His daughter's school situation, a documentary he'd watched, whether the place on the corner had gotten worse or whether we were just getting harder to please. Nothing with any weight to it. He topped up his cup and nodded toward the window. You actually look like you slept this week. Yeah, I said. Think I did. He laughed and moved on to something else, and I let the conversation keep going. I noticed, somewhere in the middle of it, that I hadn't measured a single word. I hadn't edited in real time, hadn't tracked what I was giving away, hadn't felt the low-level hum of someone paying closer attention than the moment required. I was just talking, the way you talk to someone when you're not keeping score. I didn't say anything about it. I poured another coffee, and Owen was already halfway through a story about his daughter's teacher, and I let it run. Some things don't need to be named to be understood. I used to think the hardest part of something like this was figuring out who did it. Turns out that part was easy. The harder part was sitting with how long I'd been handing that man the tools and calling it friendship. I'm over at where silence ends. Have you ever found out that someone you trusted had been quietly using your life, and looking back, realized the signs were always there?